Today, I'm going to share how to take 2 fat quarters and 1/2 yard and make a checkerboard pillow cover with an envelope back closure to put a pillow form into. So we're going to use 2 fabrics to achieve this checkerboard. This is an 18.5-inch square, and after you seam it into a pillow, it will be 18 inches. You will use an 18-inch up to a 20-inch pillow form. So this is the completed pillow cover. We are doing a checkerboard pattern, but how I'm going to teach you to do this will be a lot quicker than sewing individual squares to each other and cutting out all the individual squares. There's a couple ways that we can do this. We can make a 9 patch, and as you can see here, I have 4 9 patch blocks that once sewn together are the same checkerboard pattern as that. This allows you to use different fabrics. So you could do 4 different 9 patches that have 2 different fabrics on each. And it's a little bit more of a manageable size. How I sewed this one up, I used long strips like this. And how we're going to achieve this is cutting our fat quarter into long strips of fabric. We're going to sew those strips together, every other fabric, and then we're going to cut this strip out of a big piece of fabric that is pieced strips. So these 2 were cut out of strips like that. So if it was like this kind of, I'm cutting out a width from my piece that we're going to sew. And then because I use non-directional fabric, that's key for this type of sewing, I flip my strip upside down, and now I can sew these 2 together, and I'll continue that until I get my full pillow cover. The 9 patch is done exactly the same way. It's just sewing less strips together. For the 18-inch pillow, I'm going to sew 6 strips together. For a 9 patch, I'm only going to sew 3 strips together, but we'll get to that shortly here. So I'm going to grab my fat quarter, 2 of them, non-directional fabric ideally, and I'm going to grab my 1/2 yard and share that with you. So we're going to just set that to the side. Okay, this is my 1/2 yard piece. It comes off the bolt folded in half. So if you unfold it fully, this is a 1/2 yard. And this side that has kind of this furry edge is a selvage, and this is also a selvage. So a 1/2 yard is selvage to selvage, and it's 18 inches tall. So that's what we need for the backing of our pillow. I like to keep that nice fold as it comes off the bolt to get a nice clean cut line. So I'm going to leave this open and pull it to the side. We'll bring that back in a minute. These are fat quarters. They are what you get when you cut a 1/2 yard directly in half on the fold. So remember that fold here? If I cut that in half, I would have 2 pieces roughly the same size. A fat quarter is roughly 21 to 22 inches, and then the 18 inches tall, the same as a 1/2 yard. So this is what we're going to use for the cover, for the front of our pillow cover. And what you need to make sure of with your fat quarter to make sure that there are enough fabric, because fat quarters often have different widths. Sometimes fabric from salvage to the other salvage, it's not the same width depending on the manufacturer. So you want to make sure you have 21 inches from this salvage edge, maybe a 1/2 inch in, because we want to cut off that salvage edge, to the other side. And we're going to actually, you can see this one is, I don't know if it's factory cut or not. I bought it as a fat quarter, but it's a little bit askew, which is fine. We'll work with that. This one I cut off of yardage in my own sewing room, so it's a little bit more square. So I'm going to talk to you how I like to cut these out. So I am going to cut these at the same time. If you feel comfortable doing that, please do. If you don't, then cut one at a time, but use the same method each time. What I'm doing here is aligning up my salvage edge so it's perfectly aligned. And I'm actually going to take my rotary cutter and I'm going to take my long ruler. This is a 24-inch ruler. I like this length. I am going to cut off that salvage edge. And what I want to do when I cut off that salvage edge is cut off sometimes there's little holes in there. Sometimes you can see there is just a different weave at the edge. Sometimes it's printed. You want to cut off the full salvage edge. I'll show you on this one. See how we have this printed edge? So we want to cut off from the white over. It can be a little bit more. This one we can kind of see has some little holes in it. We want to make sure we cut all that off. It's usually about 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to align my ruler a little bit away from the salvage edge. I can go in a little bit farther than this actually, but keeping it very parallel to the actual line of the salvage. And that's going to give me a nice straight line. My rotary cutter needs to be changed. That will give us a perfectly straight edge. Now, next we need to cut our second edge and then our third edge. Because we're doing fat quarters, because we're piecing strips together, we want them to be the exact same length. I'm actually going to rotate this a little bit, and to rotate it, you're just going to grab both pieces and keep them aligned exactly on that cut line. Don't shift them from each other. Keep them together. I don't typically use the lines on my cutting mat. With larger pieces, you definitely can and may need to at times, but I almost always exclusively use my ruler. We now have turned it so that cut edge that we just cut is closest to me. And I want to trim this edge down perfectly straight. You can see this is not straight, and you can see underneath that this is not exactly straight. So I just want to align my ruler with one of the lines on this nice straight cut edge as close as I can to these fabrics. I can get a little bit more out there because we want to maintain as much of the fabric as we can. And then we're going to trim that down. Okay, I just changed my blade. Hopefully that will keep it a little bit. Okay, what I just did there was rotate my fabric one last time. I cut off my salvage edge and I cut one of the long edges, and then I want to cut the other short edge that was directly across from the salvage. I want to make sure that my fabric is going to be at least 21 inches, and we are going to just eke that out. I can go a little bit past it, which is good. Just always better to have a little bit of buffer if your fabric allows. And cut that last line of fabric. And then just making sure that that's a straight line. They're both equal. Now, what I need to do, because for the pillow cover, these squares are finishing after they're seamed in at 3 inches. So this square, if you measured it from seam to seam, it's 3 inches. But we need to account for the seam allowance. So we have to add a 1/4 inch to every side. So we're going to cut those at 3.5 inches. We're actually going to cut strips. So I am lining my 3.5 inch mark on my ruler. So I have 1, 2, 3 inches and then a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to cut across there. And remember, I'm cutting through both fabrics, so I'm getting 2 strips at the same time. I need 3 strips of each color. So I'm going to cut that 2 more times. You can see I just shifted my fabric down a little bit. That's just to get it closer to me for leverage. You want to make sure as you're cutting to put pressure on your cutting ruler. Now, pardon me a little bit because at this point in my recording, my microphones went out and I did not realize. So I'm going to be voicing over the rest of the video. So I want you to put pressure on your ruler, pushing it down after you align it. And I also want you to be putting pressure on the rotary cutter against the ruler as you also push it across in the direction that you are cutting it. So you want the ruler to stay very still and not shift, and you want that rotary cutter to stay against the edge of the ruler as you're pushing it to do the cut. So this might just take a little bit of practice. You have a little bit of extra fabric here, so feel free to cut a couple 1/4 inch lines, just practicing that cutting and measuring with the 1/4 inch line on your long ruler. Okay, so we are going to put aside that extra fabric. You might need it later, so keep track of it. And we want to order these strips in an every other fabric order so that we can sew them together in one large block of fabric. So you can see here, I am just arranging them every other fabric, and I am kind of demonstrating that we want non-directional fabric. So you can see here, this fabric side to side would be directional, but if you flip it upside down or right side up, it's not directional. So that fabric works. This pink fabric that I have for the backing is definitely directional. The guitars go in one direction, so if you turn it upside down, they would look weird. And of course, if you turn it side to side, they wouldn't be right either. So the gold is non-directional fully, and the purple and white flowers are directional side to side, but because we're only flipping right side up and upside down, it's not a big deal. You can see these tomatoes are also directional side to side. You wouldn't want the tomatoes to go sideways where the little green tops are sideways, but you could turn them upside down fully. This gold fabric here is actually a little bit directional top to bottom. It works flipping it because it has moons, but you wouldn't want to flip it side to side. So once we get all of these strips together, we're going to sew them up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance between each different strip. You could pin them if you wanted to. Once we have them sewn, we are going to cut out those checkered strips so that we can make the finished quilt. Whoops, I meant finished pillow here. So if you wanted to do a 9-patch version, the only difference would be that you would do 2 sets of 3 strips, and you need the strip sets to be opposite. So one strip set needs to have the same fabric on the top and bottom with a different fabric in between, and then you're flipping that on the other strip set. So the top and bottom fabric is in the middle, and the middle fabric is on the top and bottom. This way you can make 9 patch blocks instead of doing the whole pillow cover at once. And it allows you to have a little bit more flexibility with fabric. So you need 4 9-patch blocks to make the 18.5-inch pillow cover. Now, I apologize if occasionally through filming what I'm saying in the voiceover doesn't quite match my hands. I can't always remember verbatim what I said during the recording process. So for the purposes of this video, we are going to just sew up the 6 strips together and not make actual 9 patches. So I'm going to put 2 strips right side together so that I can align them to sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance on one side. Ideally, we're going to line up both ends so that they're perfectly aligned. And I'm going to pin along the side that we are putting our seam down. This helps keep everything together and is a good option for a beginner. Now, as I put it through the machine, I'm going to have the fabric move out to the left of the foot, and there's just going to be a little bit of fabric on the right hand side of the foot. We are going to be sewing down the right hand side. So that's the side I want to pin. And I want my pins to be directional, and then that they point towards the top of the fabric or towards the foot of the sewing machine so that I can easily pull them out as I'm sewing down that piece. So for my next 2 sets of strips, I'm just going to pin in the middle, and this way, as I'm having it go through the machine, I can make sure that the top 2 ends are aligned perfectly, and I can use that middle pin to keep it aligned perfectly. And when I get to the end where there's not a pin, I'm also going to make sure that's aligned perfectly. And then our last set of strips, we're not going to do any pins. You can choose to use pins on all of them or try these different methods to see what you're most comfortable with. Once you get sewing a little bit more, you may not need pins at all, or you might decide that you always need pins so that you get the accuracy that you desire. It's really kind of up to you in what method works best for you to have accurate quarter seam allowances. Okay, so we have our 3 strips ready to go. I'm starting with the strip that has the 3 pins in it. And once I take the pins out, I'm going to put them in a pin cushion that I'm going to have close to my sewing machine. Now I want to make sure that my 1/4 inch foot is aligned on the edge of my fabric to the right of the presser foot. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, you probably have 1/4 inch marks on the surface of your sewing machine, and you want to align the edge of your fabric with that 1/4 inch mark. Worst case, you can measure from the middle of the needle out a 1/4 inch to the right and put a piece of like washi tape down on the bed of the sewing machine, and then use your washi tape edge to align your fabric with. You want to sew a perfect 1/4 inch, so getting that correct is ideal. Now, when we are sewing, we are going to be using about a 2 stitch length. You can see that dial on the right of the machine with the numbers, and the 2 is towards the top, and that's the stitch length I'm working with. You can backstitch at the beginning and end of your strips, sewing them together, but we are going to be cutting them apart, so the backstitch is not super necessary here. I don't tend to backstitch with sewing quilts unless it's going to be a while between sewing pieces together. Now, as you're sewing through the machine, you are not pulling or pushing the fabric at all. You are just using your hands to guide the fabric on that 1/4 inch seam allowance and letting the machine pull the fabric through itself. There are feed dogs underneath, so they are pulling the fabric along with your presser foot. You just want to use your hands to keep the edge of your fabric on the right hand side aligned with the 1/4 inch seam mark. As you're sewing and you come up to a needle, you can stop. I guess it would be coming up to a pin. Stop the machine, and ideally your needle from your machine would stop in the needle down position so that if you bump anything, your fabric doesn't shift. And then you can pull that pin out and continue sewing once you've got the pin stored in a pin cushion. Once you get to the end of your strips, you can backstitch again or not. Like I said, we're going to be cutting these apart, so you will have edges where there's no backstitching. So I do actually have a cutter button on the foot of my machine. You might have a cutter button somewhere on your machine that you push with your fingers, or you can lift your presser foot, pull your fabric out to the side, and clip those threads coming off of the bobbin and the spool with a sewing machine. Now this is the next set of strips, and I do only have the pin in the middle. So I want to make sure that those two edges are aligned perfectly as I put it into my sewing machine. And I am doing a back stitch here. And then I'm sewing my 1/4 inch seam down the side. Once I get to the pin, I will pull the pin out. Something to be said here is that you can play around with the speed of how fast your sewing machine goes. There is usually a little button or a slide bar somewhere on your machine that goes from a turtle to a rabbit. And the turtle is the slowest your machine will go, and the rabbit is usually the fastest. So go slow and practice shifting the fabric or just guiding the fabric through, keeping it on the 1/4 inch mark. And as you get used to that and you consistently get a straight line, you can increase your speed and try that way. After I get to the middle of this strip that I had the pin in, I am going to stop and take the pin out, and then I'm just going to make sure that my two ends at the bottom are aligned perfectly and kind of hold them together and let it slide through the machine as I'm holding those two ends together so that they don't shift apart and I have an even end at the end of my strip. So our last strip, I didn't pin it all. You can see here, I'm just opening it up to show you a nice straight seam. My last set of strips, I didn't pin it all. And so you can try this method or you can continue on with your pins. The nice thing about quilting fabric is it has a tiny bit of stretch. So once you align those two starting ends and you get it moving through the machine, after you've gone an inch or two, I like to measure the other side by aligning the two ends together and kind of pulling my fabric, not stretching it, but just pulling it out to make sure the two fabrics are staying the same length. And then as I get closer to the end, I'm going to kind of do that again. When you're sewing really long strips together, sometimes they can get askew, even if they're cut at the exact same length. So checking it throughout the sewing process is just a good practice to have. Now that I have my 3 sets of 2 strips sewn together, I'm going to sew the sets of strips to each other. Remember, we want to make sure our fabric goes opposite fabrics next to each other. So I just showed you an example of the wrong way, and we want to be careful not to do that. We want to line up our fabrics, every other fabric, and then once we have the 2 pieces next to each other in the right format, turn them facing each other so right sides are together, and we're going to sew it the same way we sewed the 2 strips together. We're just sewing 2 sets of strips together. So we're going to do that, and once we get those 4 strips sewn together, we're going to add the last set of 2 strips so we have all 6 strips sewn together. I am increasing my speed here on the video, so don't freak out. I can't actually sew this fast. Wouldn't that be amazing? But we're just going to finish sewing up all the strips together so we have one large piece of fabric, and I am sewing much faster than normal, so it goes really quickly, which is nice. Okay, we are at the ironing board and we want to press all those seams that we just sewed at the machine. So we want all of our seams on the back of this piece to point in the same direction because we are going to be nesting seams after we cut this piece of fabric into strips. So we want to be careful as we are ironing that we don't get any extra folded material in next to the seam. So from the front side facing down, we're going to be ironing those seams in one direction. Now you want to be careful not to put a lot of pressure flat and drag because we don't want to make these long seams wavy. That's rather easy to do. We just are putting not really pressure on the iron, just setting it down and slowly pulling it over the seams and down, so the seams are going down towards me. This can take a little bit of practice. It's the difference between pressing a seam and ironing a seam. And while we do want just a little bit of tug at the bottom there, so our seams are all going in the same direction and we don't have any extra fold over in those seam allowances on the front, we also want to be very careful to do this slow and even so that those lines do not get wavy or askew at all, which is very easy to happen. I just would recommend not using steam. Use a dry iron because steam could skew the fabric more than you want it to. So we have all of our seams pointing in one direction. We're going to flip it over to the front side, and we want to make sure all those seam allowances are laying flat, going in the direction they were just ironed. And you're going to just iron across the top of it. And this will help you see if there's any little folded over extra fabric near the seams that you can iron out and make sure everything is flat and nice and straight on the front. So in this case, we are ironing in one direction, but in some instances, you may want to iron a seam open, and that is taking this little seam allowance where the two fabrics meet and ironing one piece of the fabric in one direction and the other piece of the fabric in the other direction so that it's an open seam. It just reduces bulk, and sometimes patterns call for that. So we have our piece laying right side up on the cutting board here, and we want to cut it into strips that are like these strips. You want to cut your strip the same width that you cut your single fabric strips in height. So we cut our strips before sewing them in 3.5 inches tall. And we want to keep our strips here, cutting the checkered strips in 3.5 inch wide strips. So if the side of your big piece of fabric is not perfectly even, do a very light trim off as little as possible. We don't have a lot of extra on these fat quarters, but it's always nice to have that first cut be really nice and straight. So I'm just cutting off a little bit here. It's just a sliver, and you might be fine not doing that. And then from there, I'm going to measure from that nice, precise side 3.5 inches. But I also want to keep the perpendicular lines on the ruler to be level with the strip seams of my piece of fabric that I sewed. And then I'm going to cut 3.5 inch strips across the whole piece of pieced fabric. And once we get all of those cut, we'll see the magic here that happens. But as you can see, I'm just kind of shifting them away after I cut them and continuing to align at 3.5 inches and cut all of my strips. I did mention before you need at least 21 inches wide, and ideally you would have 21.5. After I worked on making this pillow, I realized that with a little bit of error, sometimes 21 inches is not enough. And so I ended up having a tiny bit smaller strip at the end, which I can work with, but I would prefer you not have that. So I would recommend making sure your fat quarters are minimum of 21.5 inches wide. And I do mention this in my pattern, the written tutorial that you can download. So it is there Once we have them all cut, we are going to take every other strip and flip it upside down, which gives us that checkerboard effect. And you can see that's why we need to have the non-directional fabric also. Now I'm going to sew just like I did before, groups of 2 strips together. And once we flip the strips upside down, every other strip will have the seams moving in the opposite direction, which will allow them to nest as we sew them together. That means where the seams kind of butt up together, the seam allowances should be going in the opposite direction. And we have a little bit of give there to push those seams towards each other to make sure that our alignment is perfect once sewn. We are going to sew these the exact same way as we sewed the single fabric strips, but I do want to make sure you backstitch at the beginning and end because this is our final pillow cover, and that backstitch will help us keep all those edges nice and crisp and together. Sometimes even with a smaller stitch length, they can pop a little bit, so we want to backstitch at the beginning and end of sewing these strips together. As we sew down and get to these seams that are the allowances go in different directions, we want to kind of try to align those seams as well as possible. And that's just kind of pushing the seams into each other. They should just kind of butt directly right into each other. Keep track of which way the seams go on the top or bottom of your strips and make sure they don't get twisted as they're sliding through the machine, because that sometimes can happen as well. As you can see here, once I get to a seam, I just kind of press it towards each other to make sure it's as aligned as well as I possibly can get it. This will not be perfect, but you could always unpick a little bit if you want it to line up better, or we can just live with imperfections because life isn't perfect, right? We do have 2 strips now sewn together, and we did a pretty decent job where those points and those seams align rather nicely. I'm sure there's 1 or 2 like this one that doesn't align quite perfectly, but in the grand scheme of things, you really won't be able to tell. So we're going to sew the other 2 sets of checkered strips together and do the same process of backstitching at the beginning and end. And as you get to the seams, you want to make sure they bump right next to each other, but the seam allowances stay flat in the direction they've been ironed. I do end up speeding the video up here because we're just continuing to sew all the strip sets together. And just like we did the single fabric strips to make one final piece of stripped fabric, we are sewing all of these checkered strips together to make our final pillow front for our pillow cover. So continue sewing your strips, back stitching at the beginning of end, checking and butting those seams up together, and finish your pillow cover and meet me at the ironing board. Okay, here we are. We have our finished pillow front for our cover. It's all checkered with 2 different fabrics. We are going to iron this the exact same way as we ironed just the single fabric strips. The only difference is now you have the additional seams that have been ironed already, but they do go in different directions on each set of strips. So just as you're ironing those wide seams across the whole pillow cover down in the same direction, just keep track of the seams going perpendicular to the long seams to make sure that you don't iron them out of place. Sometimes it'll happen, just get your iron back in there and iron them flat again. The goal is that all of our seam allowances are flat within the seams and they are all ironed flat in one direction for the seams going all the way across the pillow. And then you can flip it over just like we did for just the single fabric strips and do that one last pressing, just tugging any little fold overs along the seams out if that happened at all, and making sure the front is pressed nice and flat, being mindful of the seams on the back that they continue moving in the direction that they have been ironed and they don't get ironed out of place. So there's our pillow cover top. So we are going to move on to the next step. First, I just want to talk for a minute about making your pillow larger than the 18.5 inches. So with the fat quarters, we can only get our 6 strips out of them. So you will need more fabric for a larger pillow. Using the 9 patch method, you could make a larger pillow with 9 patches, and you could also mix up the fabrics a little bit more. You need 4 9 patches for an 18-inch pillow, and then beyond that, it's going to increase in 9-inch increments. So that would be quite a large pillow. That's a great technique to make a full quilt as well, making 9 patches. If you want to increase, say, your 18-inch pillow to 21 inches, it gets tricky because to do the strips and flip them, we need an even amount of strips so that the top strip and the bottom strip are the opposite color. So when we flip them, they align. If you're doing an odd amount of strips, your fabric ends up being the same at the top and bottom. And when you flip it, it won't make the checkerboard effect. So to make a 21-inch pillow, you would make the 18-inch square like we did, but using longer strips of fabric, cut a few extra, and you could put a strip on the side and an extra strip along the bottom, and then fill in that corner with a square that you cut out of your leftover fabric. I'm going to align this last strip here. So if you used 1/2 yards to cut out really long strips, you would be able to cut more checkerboard strips once you have everything sewn and make a little bit longer pillow. But it's a little bit more of a cobbled method because if you're doing a size of pillow where your strips would end up with the same fabric on the top and bottom, even number of strip or odd number of strips, it wouldn't really work. So play around with it. You could make this method work for different sizes, or you could use different size squares. But as long as you are using an even amount of strips, you are going to be able to do that cut and flip the checkerboard strip to method. And it'll work out. For this pillow, we are using the envelope back closure, which means that you are cutting the fabric so that in the middle of the back, the fabric overlaps 6 to 7 inches so that you can pull those 2 pieces apart and stuff your pillow form in, or push those 2 pieces back together and they'll overlap and you won't see the pillow form at all. It's a very simple method and a quick method. If you would like a zipper tutorial, you can check out the Woollypetals blog, and there is a post up about how to do a zipper. So to cut our pieces, we want to open our 1/2 yard up, and we want to cut off that selvage to give us a nice straight edge to start with. And then we need to cut an 18.5 inch wide piece of fabric because that's how wide our pillow cover is. If you were cutting for a different size pillow, you would cut a width that is the width of your pillow cover. Now my fabric's sideways here, so that registration cut I made cutting the selvage off is my side, and I'm going to measure up 18 inches from there to cut my 18-inch width. This might be a good time to use your measuring mat and aligning the bottom edge along one of your measure lines and then measuring up 18.5 inches and using the measuring lines at 18.5 inches to cut one long cut across the fabric. Because if you just align your ruler to cut 18.5 inches, the other side of that ruler is too small to cut across the whole width of fabric. So I just cut my 18.5 inches tall, And now aligning my ruler on the two nice cut edges, I want to cut a nice smooth edge going perpendicular to the two cut edges. I wouldn't recommend cutting the way I just did. I didn't want to rotate the fabric for you, but ideally you would always cut with your rotary cutter on the right hand side of the ruler if you're right-handed. So what I kind of want to do here is make sure my fabric is the correct width, that it matches the pillow cover. And I am kind of trying to determine how tall to make my fabric. If you have the downloaded pattern, it's going to tell you how tall to make your fabric. And if you are kind of figuring out for a different size pillow, make sure you have a good 6 to 7 inches of overlap in the middle of your pillow for your two pieces. Again, this is just one of the pieces for the back. And I've determined if I cut it about 14 inches tall, about 2/3 of the height plus about an inch of the pillow cover front, because I do need a little extra fabric to fold over so that I can have a nice hemmed edge. So I'm doing the same method here where I align the bottom. You can see now my fabric is going directionally. So the bottom of my fabric is going to be on a measure line, and I'm going to measure up 14 inches and cut off that little extra piece. It's a great scrap piece, so you can use it for something later. Now I need to cut a second piece that's the exact same as this piece. And you can do the same method by measuring and trimming and cutting out just like I did the first piece. Or you can lay the first piece directly on top of your leftover fabric and cut out your second piece using the edges of your first piece, which I usually like to do. It goes a little bit faster. The only instance you might not do this is if you want to pattern match where they're going to overlap. And you may or may not want to do that. It doesn't make a huge difference if it's pattern matched once the pillow form is in there, because the pillow form puffs it up and skews it a little bit. So the pattern match usually doesn't really matter. I don't typically do that. It's just the back of a pillow, so not a big deal. But you can see it's a little bit tricky because it's the same fabric, but I'm just kind of rotating my fabric and cutting around my existing piece that I measured out and cut out first. Once I have my two pieces cut out, I'm just kind of separating them, and I'm going to align them just to make sure that I have the right amount overlapping in the middle. Again, I want each piece to be about 2/3 the height of our pillow front, and a little bit additional for the seam allowance. Once I sew it all up, I want the top piece to be on the top. So this is where the bottom piece is on the top, and we would have a little bit of a gap there. So we'll go through that later. So I've moved over to my ironing board so I can hem the pieces and use my iron to iron those folds in place. Now remember, if you have directional fabric for the back, you want to hem the top of one piece and the bottom of the other piece. If your fabric is not directional, just hem one of the long sides on each piece and we'll figure it out later. You want to hem about 1/2 inch, fold it over, and I use my iron to iron that fold in place. Before you iron, if you want to do a quick measure with your ruler and then iron a little bit and then measure a little bit and iron a little bit, the fabric usually folds nicely in an even manner. And so you don't always need to measure, but it's good to do on your first tries. Once you have one fold ironed in place, you're going to fold it over one more time to fully close off that raw edge. And this will be a little bit easier to iron because you have the edge of the fold butting up in that final fold, and you can get a nice clean edge there. Once you have it ironed in place, you still should probably pin it. Your fold will be with your presser foot over it, and all of that extra fabric will go out to the left of your presser foot. So you want to put the pins so they are pointing up or to the left, as you see here. And you really don't need to do very many pins, probably 3 would suffice, just to keep that fold nicely aligned and pressed into place. And then as you sew it, you'll just take the pins out, just like when you sewed the seams from before. So we can see on this piece, my fabric is directional and I ironed the top edge. So that's the bottom piece of my back. So putting my second piece in the same direction, I know I want to iron the bottom of my top piece. It's the opposite. It's your bottom piece, you iron the top edge, your top piece, you iron the bottom edge for directional fabric. And we're just using the same method, ironing that edge 1/2 inch folded over, and then doing a second fold using the edge of the fabric to just kind of butt it up next to it and continue folding and ironing and pinning. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine. At our sewing machine, we're going to do a seam across the fold to hold it in place. And we want that seam to be closer to the bottom edge of the fold, not the top edge, but the bottom edge, maybe 1/8 of an inch away. And if we put the seam closer to the top edge, we'll have a lot of flapping there. So we want to basically tack down the bottom edge of that fold so it's completely closed. Now for a nice top stitch look, I do like to do a longer stitch length, closer to a 3 stitch length than a 2. And I do back stitch at the beginning and end. So align your needle so it's roughly a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge of that fold. Do a back stitch at the beginning and sew straight down, keeping your same distance from the fold and keeping it as even as possible. And then when you get to the end, you're going to do another back stitch to finish it off at the end. Taking your pins out as you go and making sure your fold stays nice and smooth and flat. And then we're going to repeat with the second piece, hemming it just the same way, 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom of the fold, back stitching at the beginning and end. And meet me back at the cutting table after. We have our 2 pieces. We are going to align them if they're directional with the fabric going in the proper direction. Basically, our 2 hemmed edges will butt up next to each other. Now on your table where you're doing this, put your pillow front right next to it. I like to align my pillow front typically with a little measuring line on my cutting table. And then I'm going to align the bottom edge of my bottom piece with the same line on my cutting mat. So it's even with the bottom edge of my pillow front. And then we're going to take the top piece and overlap it, and we're going to align it at the 18.5 inch mark above where we started with the bottom. I just flipped them to show you that's not what we wanted. We want the bottom piece that has the top edge hemmed underneath, and we want the top piece that has the bottom edge hemmed on the top, overlapping on top, with both of our fabrics right side facing up. And having that pillow cover right next to it is really nice to get an exact measurement. Sometimes our pillow covers can get a little off from the final measurement that we would like. So we just want to make sure it's the same size as our pillow cover front. You can also do that by laying your pillow cover front directly on top of it and kind of shimmying the pieces to meet the edges if you need to. Once we have it the same size as our pillow front, we can pin the two pillow back pieces together where they overlap on each side. So on one side, you will put probably 2 pins, and on the other side, put 2 pins facing the opposite direction so you can easily pull them out as you're sewing it together. And we're actually just going to baste those two sections to connect the two pieces together. Basting is just using a bigger stitch length to hold things together. It's not something that is a really tight stitch length or back stitched at all. At this point, you will have a little gapping there. You could pin it in place. It's a good time before you would baste up those sides to put a button or Velcro in that middle spot there if you didn't want any gapping. I don't tend to do that, but it is an option, and now is the time to do it before you baste those two pieces together. At our sewing machine, we can use a longer stitch length, 3 or above, and you do not need to backstitch. But you could as well, to help secure those two pieces together. I would just backstitch over where the overlap starts and stops, but it's not necessary. This is just a basting process. So just going over the section where the two fabrics overlap on each side is how we're going to baste these two pieces together so they're connected into one back. So we have our back and our front, and I do have the piece of batting here as well. We're going to set our back aside. We don't need that quite yet. We are going to quilt our pillow front. So what we need for this is our piece of batting and our piece of muslin. Muslin can be any fabric. You're not going to see it. Muslin is just cheaper, and so putting it on the inside is great, but you could use any fabric for this. Your batting is an inch or so bigger than your pillow front, and your backing or your muslin is an inch or so bigger than your batting. You're going to lay your muslin on your table, and if it has a right and a wrong side, place the right side of the fabric directly on top of the table with the wrong side of the fabric facing up. And we're actually going to tape this fabric down so it's taut on the table and doesn't have any wrinkles. You can use any tape for this. Keep in mind whatever surface you're taping to. Duct tape's probably not a good option because it can be sticky, but packing tape works. Painter's tape is really good. If you don't have tape handy, you could put a large heavy object in each corner to kind of hold it taut until you get everything on top. So just keep that in mind. If you need to use a heavy weighted object, maybe a larger piece would be better so you have more space in the middle. I'm just going to tape it in the middle of each side, pulling it a little bit taut as I place that tape on the opposite edge. If you're doing a larger quilt like this, you might want to tape more edges or start with the corners, but since it's just a small pillow piece, we're really just trying to keep it nice and smooth, and it's not very big, so you can smooth those wrinkles out as you lay the other sections on top. Once we have all 4 sides of the muslin taped down, we're going to lay the batting on the top of that. kind of centered and smoothing out from the middle, smoothing all wrinkles. Batting doesn't need to be taped down because it sticks to the fabrics. So then you're going to put the pillow cover front on top of the batting and smooth it out from the middle out, trying to make sure it's centered, that there's enough batting and muslin showing all around that, making sure your seams are all going in the direction they've been ironed so it's not bumpy at all. And just continue smoothing, making sure you don't feel any wrinkles underneath your hands as you are making it as smooth and keeping all of those seam lines as straight as possible. This is a quilting basting pin. It has a little bit of a curve through it so that you can easily rock the pin through a quilt that's taped down to the floor or a table. These are ideal for basting. You could use straight pins if you are in a bind, but you just have to be careful not to poke yourself. You could also thread baste using just a thread and needle, and run your thread and needle through a couple rows with really big stitches. If you're basting with pins, maybe every other square is going to work fine, roughly 6 inches apart. That's how much you would do for a quilt as well. I typically like to work from the middle out to the edges, just so if you need to smooth anything as you go, you're working from the middle out and it's an even smoothing from to each side. So you're going to baste the whole pillow cover to the two pieces, one piece of batting and one piece of muslin. You basically just want all 3 layers to stick together without having any large wrinkles on any of the pieces, but specifically the front. Luckily, with this piece, the muslin or the back is going to be inside the pillow, so you won't see it. So worst case, if there's a wrinkle there, it's not that big of a deal. So let's talk about quilting a little bit. Straight line quilting is always a great way to start. Going along the seam allowance, or called stitch in the ditch, is really great. Going seams down the middle of the squares, perpendicular and then horizontal, would work as a grid system. You could also do diagonally down the middle of the squares, point to point, and do a diagonal grid system. If you are worried about your machine pulling at all, sometimes some pulling of the fabric can happen without a walking foot. You could do a nice organic wavy line. And if your machine has the capability for free motion quilting and you want to try that out, pillows are a great way to start because it's a small, manageable piece of fabric and is fun to practice on. So planning out your quilting is really good to do so that you have an idea of where you need to feed it through the machine. Once you have the full quilt top or pillow top basted, you can take the tape off and you can flip it over and make sure we don't have any major wrinkles. A little tiny wrinkle, not that big of a deal, we'll smooth that out as we're quilting. Any large overlapping wrinkles are ones we want to assess and rebaste if need be. So I did actually run into a little bit of pull with my regular presser foot on my Juki. It's not the best for quilting in my experience. But I just start at the edge. I want to start in the center of the quilt and work my way out towards one side and then rotate it and start going the other direction. I actually end up rotating between each line. If you're having a little bit of pull and you notice that, which is easy to notice on a checkerboard pattern because you have a lot of seams that are horizontal, and when they start to pull, they get askew. So that little dial on the top is my presser foot. It's like how much it tightens against the machine or loosens and pulls the foot away from the machine. So you can kind of play with the adjustment of that if your machine has that capability. When I get to the other end, I actually have my needle in the down position and I pull my presser foot up and I turn my fabric and sew along the edge of the pillow to get to my next spot. I try to sew within 1/8 of an inch of the edge so it's within the seam allowance. I'm just going to the middle of the next column of squares so I can go down that column in the center because I ended up doing a grid pattern. And I stop whenever I come to a safety pin that's a basting pin and I take it out. Um, Again, you're mainly trying to guide the fabric through, not pull. I'm trying to spread my fabric a little bit more so I don't have as much of that um, pull there. You can see a tiny bit of the wrinkles. So I actually end up switching to my walking foot to eliminate the pull. Your machine might not have this problem at all, but it also might. So just play around with it, maybe even practicing on a different piece of fabric or a different quilt sandwich to know what your machine is going to do in the instance of having multiple layers like this together. The batting is what ends up making it a lot thicker than just 2 layers of fabric, and that can allow for that drag or pull of the fabric. Here I do have my walking foot on, and a walking foot sometimes comes with a machine. If not, you can often find an aftermarket one or a machine branded one. And they're not horribly expensive, in the $25 to $50 range, depending on what type it is. It just replaces your foot on your machine and it lifts the whole foot in a walking motion as you are sewing, and it allows for pulling and dragging of fabric to go away basically. So I end up quilting my whole pillow cover with individual seam lines down the middle of each set of squares. And then I flip it perpendicular and do the same thing going in the opposite direction. So I do have a grid. You would be able to backstitch at the end and beginning of each seam as long as that back stitch stays within 1/4 inch of the edge, so it's in the seam allowance. Or like I do here is I just turn my fabric and sew along that seam allowance edge until I get to my next spot to sew a vertical seam, and I don't have to do any backstitch, cutting of thread, or moving too much. So you can kind of play around what works for you with quilting. You could do all horizontal quilting lines, all vertical quilting lines, the grid like we talked about. You could stay 1/4 of an inch away from each seam line and do a grid that way, or the stitch in the ditch. You could do wavy organic lines with a regular foot and just kind of moving your fabric side to side as you're sewing a straight line will give it a wavy vibe to your line. Or you can try free motion quilting. Have fun with it. Pillows are a great way to try quilting. It's a much more manageable size project than a full quilt for your first go. If you don't feel comfortable with eyeballing where your seam goes, you could also use a water soluble or heat soluble marking device like a marker or a pen or a pencil. You can buy them at most quilt shops or fabric stores, and you could mark the lines and then sew directly on top of those lines and then iron or use a little spritz of water to remove the line. There's also something called a Hera marker, and that is it's a tool almost like a letter opener that you can, with a little bit of pressure, run along the fabric along the edge of a ruler to create a marked line. It's not a pin or a pencil. It like creates almost like an indentation in the fabric, and that creates a line a little bit harder to see, but you don't have to remove it. It'll just wash out or eventually fall out because creases in fabrics don't hang along too much. I am finishing up the quilting on this. I started going a little bit faster so that the video would be done quicker for us, and we're going to move to the cutting table after I'm done quilting. Okay, we are going to cut off the excess batting and muslin by aligning our ruler on the edge of our pillow front and using our rotary cutter to slice off that batting and muslin only. Ideally, our edges of our pillow cover will be nice and straight, and then we can easily just trim off the backing. Aligning your ruler on the edge of the pillow as well as one of the perpendicular edges to make sure everything stays at a 90-degree angle. We do want to be careful that we're not cutting into the pillow cover at all because we don't want to skew the squares once that final seam is sewn. We need them all to appear to be the same size. Here on this final size, because a little bit of that pulling of the fabric happened, it got a little bit unstraight. So I'm just kind of tugging on the fabric a little bit to straighten it out on the edge of the ruler. I would rather do that than cut off part of the pillow cover in this instance. In some spots, you might have a little extra batting or muslin stick out past the pillow cover front. As long as it's less than 1/8 of an inch, it's not that big of a deal. It'll be hidden in the seam and should be fine. But if it's getting bigger than 1/8 of an inch, I would trim it down a little bit farther. Just keeping in mind, we want the squares on the edges to finish as close as possible to our 3-inch finished square as they can. So we're going to take our pillow back and we're going to lay it right side up, and we want to make sure that it's oriented in the correct direction with that fabric going the correct direction and the bottom edge of the envelope closure where it should be. We're going to lay our pillow directly on top of it, aligning all the edges. You might have to shimmy a little bit, but you want to make sure that everything stays as flat and lined up as possible. And then we're going to start pinning it. Again, note the direction of your pins, that they all continue in the same direction as you rotate the pillow around. So they're easy to pull out as we're sewing. And pin once or twice per side, probably twice per side, closer to each corner, until you have all 4 sides pinned into place. So once it's all pinned, we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the whole pillow, and we're going to backstitch at the beginning and the end of that seam all the way around to lock our stitches on one side. Usually those back stitches will overlap, so we're sure that everything is closed up. We don't have to leave an opening because we're going to pull the pillow right sides out through the envelope closure, and that's where we're going to stuff the pillow form into as well. So the last thing I'd like to explain is angling our corner seams in a little bit. This is a technique I learned from interior design workrooms to give our pillow a really nice shape. When we do a 1/4 inch seam allowance and have a perfectly square seam in those corners, once we term it with the extra fabric, it can make that corner be too pointy. So what I like to do is we want to have about 1.5 inches from the corner. We want to angle our seam in a little bit further. So when we get to the corner where we're turning our fabric to go down the other side. We're maybe at 3/8 of an inch in from each side. So you could actually mark a little dot 3/8 in from each corner edge, and about 1.5 inches away from that, you could start to angle towards that dot. On that dot, you're going to put your needle down. You're going to lift your foot and rotate your fabric, and then align it going on the next side, and then you're going to angle out from that point back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the side. In the downloadable tutorial, there is a little diagram with a dotted line that shows how your seam should look on that corner, and that might explain it a little bit better. You could, of course, keep your seams at a perfect 1/4 of an inch and go all the way to a 1/4 inch away from the corner, and then turn and go back down a 1/4 of an inch. It's not the biggest deal, but it does make the shape of your pillow a little bit different than doing this finish technique. Okay, at our machine, just make sure that your pieces on the back, because they have that extra give where they overlap, everything stays aligned on the side. If you feel like you need to, you could add some more pins there. We're going to start in the middle of one side, and we're going to align it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to do a back stitch at this point. When we come back around to this side, we are going to back stitch on top of that, or go a little bit past and back stitch again. So I'm just going to sew down until I get about 1.5 to 2 inches away from this corner. And as I'm going to this corner, I'm going to just angle it in a little bit more, like I said. So when I get to the end, I'm about 3/8 of an inch away from the corner instead of a 1/4 inch away. I'm going to put my needle down. I'm going to lift my foot and turn my fabric so I can go down the next side. And from the corner, I'm going to angle back out to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew that 1/4 inch seam allowance till I get to about the same spot and start to angle in on my next corner again. And this is just doing the same method, needle down, lifting my foot, turning the fabric, putting the foot back down, and starting to angle back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's how you achieve the corner. You don't have to backstitch the corner. You don't have to stop the sewing and backstitch and cut your threads and then start again. Strictly by using that needle down position, you can turn your fabric and continue down the next side. Once you have finished all of your corners and sides, you're going to get to the end where you started. Let's round this last corner in the video here. I ended up running out of thread right at that last corner, so I had to stop and do my bobbin and start again. If that happens to you, just start back 1 inch or so from the end of where your stitches end and do a back stitch, and then continue over those existing stitches. That will help lock everything in place and nothing comes unraveled. And you're going to do that same thing basically when you get to the starting point of doing your seams all the way around. You're going to go over that beginning seam just 1 inch maybe, and then do a little bit of a back stitch to lock those stitches in place. The back stitch, or some machines have a lock stitch, literally lock the stitches where they are, so that it is much harder for it to unravel. So we're going to do one last thing before we turn our pillow. At the corners, we're going to clip off any excess fabric. You want to still be away from the stitches, maybe 1/8 of an inch. You don't want to cut right next to the stitches, but we want to cut off at a 45-degree angle so that when we turn it right side out, there's not a bunch of extra fabric in those corners, and it helps reduce bulk and give us a nice pointy corner. Okay, now that your pillow is sewn along all 4 sides, you're just gonna, through the envelope back, pull it right sides out. Use your finger or a blunt object like a dowel or a blunt pencil to poke those corners out. Hopefully your finger should suffice because we clipped off a bunch of that extra bulk there. Just be gentle because there's not as much seam allowance in those corners after the clipping, so you don't want to poke through a seam. Like I said, a blunt pencil or the eraser end of a pencil might work too, but I think you should be able to do it with just your fingers. And so once you get it all poked out and smooth, you can just kind of smooth your pillow out. You may need to iron it a little bit with that quilted edge and the non-quilted back. You might need to iron it. I was just actually showing you there what that angled corner can do. If you don't angle the corner in on the seam, it can make those sides look a little bit concave, like my hand motion showed there. This is our envelope back, and we're going to stuff it with a pillow form. The pillows I like and use the most are these pillows from IKEA, and I do link them in the blog post. They're $7 for a down pillow form. This is a 20-inch square pillow form. I do recommend going 1 to 2 inches larger than your pillow cover for your pillow form size. That helps just plump the pillow up and fill it fully out. A little trick I learned from being an interior designer as well. So to stuff it, you're just going to go through that envelope back closure, kind of open it up and start stuffing your pillow in one side. And then once you get it mostly in there, you're going to stuff it in the other side, pulling your back over. And you're just going to kind of push those points of your pillow form into the corners of your cover. And once you get it mostly in there, you can do a few slams down onto the table to kind of fluff it up. I did that and then my camera fell off of its mount, so I am not going to demonstrate that, but just kind of pushing and fluffing to get those corners out perfect. So you can see with the shape here that it is a little concave on the corners. And if you don't do that angled seam on the corners, it's even more concave than it appears here. So that is one of the reasons I recommend those angled corner seams. And you can see the nice envelope closure back there. It pulls apart a little, but it's not too bad. It still fully hides the pillow form. And here I just thought I would show you the pillow on my comfy reading chair in my sewing room. You can see a little bit of the fabric from different angles on the back, so it's always nice to make sure that that coordinates well with the front. But it's a really cute pillow, and I hope you enjoyed making it with me.